Hello, everybody. In this podcast, I interviewed Dr. Campbell, who is a leading researcher in veganism, although he doesn't like that word. He would call it a whole food plant based diet. It was an interesting interview. I did not go easy on him, but he seemed to take it well. I definitely had a lot more to talk about, but time was obviously the limiting factor. I feel like these issues, to really dissect them, you need to delve much more deeply than we did, and present the evidence and really go through it. But obviously, it's not easy to do that. Anyway, I hope you like. Bye bye. Welcome to Self Hacked Radio, where cutting edge science meets cutting edge health. Hello, everybody. I am here with Dr. Colin Campbell. He is a nutritional biochemist and professor emeritus at Cornell, and he is the co-author of the China study. Now, what diet do you advocate, Dr. Campbell?
Well, I don't really like that much the word diet because what I'm talking about is a dietary lifestyle. In other words, the difference being that a diet is something you try now to solve some problem or whatever you want, lose weight or whatever, and then you go back to doing what you want to before. So this is a whole lifestyle. You have to make the change, stay with it. You let your taste preferences change, and you'll discover some amazing things. That's what the bottom line is. The second thing I want to say is that I don't talk about a vegan diet. Some of my antagonists like to say I'm talking about a vegan diet. I am not. I never used the word one time in the China study. Basically, the difference between a vegan diet and what I'm talking about is that a vegan diet basically was an attempt by people for ideological reasons to choose what they chose to do. They didn't quite get the nutrition right, because a lot of vegans, the average fat intake of a vegan diet is right, according to the latest data, is around 30% fat. That's way too high. Number one. Number two, all they're trying to do is avoid animal foods, and so they end up also consuming refined carbohydrates at too high a level. So vegans are too high fat, too much refined carbohydrates, and they have some nutritional advantages, but not the kind that we're talking about. I want to make that clear.
Okay, so how is your diet different than, let's say, a whole food, low-fat vegan diet? Is there any differences?
Well, I don't use the word vegan. I said I just call it a whole food, plant-based diet. But that means whole foods. You don't use the processed stuff. You don't add back a lot of salt, sugar, and fat. And you take the food as it was grown, and you combine it in various and sundry ways to make delicious dishes.
But is there any practical differences? I know you don't like to use the word vegan, but is there any practical differences between a whole food, low-fat vegan diet and what you advocate? Just to be clear, people want to know exactly. It kind of gives them the idea of what they should be eating.
Well, a vegan diet, as I said, they use a lot of oil and fat. They use fried foods and all that kind of stuff.
Right. So low-fat, whole food, vegan diet.
Why do you want to use the word vegan? I don't want to use the word vegan. Just okay. Whole food, plant-based diet.
Plant-based, but do you think any animal products are healthy?
No, I don't.
Why are animal products bad?
Well, we tend to consume animal products historically as well as in the present day, primarily in order to eat as much protein as we can get. It's really about protein more than anything else. And that's been true for decades, for centuries almost. People tend to think that we need to get as much protein as possible. Well, it turns out most people also think that protein only comes from animal foods. It doesn't. We can get all the protein we need from plant foods. In fact, the ideal level of protein is the amount that's provided by whole food, plant-based diet. As soon as we start putting animal foods in the diet in order to get that protein, we distort the rest of the diet very quickly. In other words, when we start eating animal-based foods, then we're displacing the foods we ought to be eating, namely the whole food, plant-based diet, basically whole plant-based foods. Those foods are the ones that have all the antioxidants. They're the ones that have the complex carbohydrates. Complex carbohydrates are only made in plant foods. So if you're going to go to an animal food diet, you're getting much less antioxidants. You're getting much less complex carbohydrates, and you're getting the wrong levels of fat and protein. It's hugely different.
And what's bad about protein?
Okay, here's what's bad about protein. I have spent this August will be I'll be beginning my 60th year. That's 60, my 60th year in research, and it started out actually with my enthusiasm for making sure we got enough protein, just like everybody else did. And so we went many years with lots of funding, a lot of students, postdocs doing this research. And so this is all based on research. It's not my opinion. This is based on research. That when we increase protein, animal protein in the diet above the level that's normally required, which is 10% of total calories, when we do that, we turn on cancer. That's not a very good idea. We also elevate blood cholesterol levels, which leads to heart disease. That's been known for over 100 years. It's just information that's been mostly ignored because everybody tends to worship protein so much that if anyone comes along and begins to discover some information about this protein that isn't very desirable, people want to ignore it. And so the protein itself, in our laboratory research, and I published this extensively in the professional literature, we've got something like 300 and some publications. And it was all funded by the NIH. So it's strictly, I want to re-emphasize that. This is not opinion. I have no relationship with an industry, so I don't have that agenda to push on anybody. It's strictly based on what we did. And here's what we did. We found that the protein, the animal protein, and the protein we used was the main protein of cow's milk. When that is increased above the level that we need, for one thing, it activates carcinogens that may be in the diet dramatically. And what I mean by that, the carcinogens that we might be consuming, they actually are metabolized to products that actually bind to the genes and that's what starts the cancer. Mm-hmm. They also elevate the level of a hormone, insulin-like growth factor, we call it. And that's really what enables cells to grow faster and bigger. And that's not what we want. So the high protein diet is turning on the growth of cancer cells. It's activating the carcinogens, so more of the carcinogen is able to bind to the DNA. It also changes the whole equation about the calories in, calories out idea. When you use a whole food plant-based diet, you can actually consume a little more calories, not less. And as a result, you get much less cancer.
Mm-hmm. So my question is regarding, so there's two main mechanisms that you mentioned that it can cause cancer. One is IGF-1, but IGF-1 is a performance hormone as well. That's number one. And it's also only going to come into play once you already have cancer and it's growing, so it'll make it grow a little quicker. But it's not, to my knowledge, it's not going to start cancer. That's is that? Would you say that's true?
No, it's totally wrong.
Okay.
100% wrong. Because in the laboratory, what we did, we could take, when we had use the casein, in this case, is the protein of cow's milk. When we brought it down to something less than 10%, cancer did not grow, even though in those circumstances, they had an overdose of carcinogen. It was really quite incredible. We could turn it on completely or turn it off completely, like a 0% versus 100%. Mm-hmm. I mean, it wasn't a small change, it was huge. And so we could get to a point where once the cancer starts, after it's growing, we could actually just decrease the protein and turn the cancer off. And
okay.
That was dramatic.
So there's 2 points there. So first of all, your studies were done on casein, and casein is it's an interesting protein. It's a very inflammatory protein, and I certainly don't do well with it. It's in all dairy, and so I know when I take in casein, I get inflammation, and very few people actually do well with casein, and they notice it. Most people do not do well with dairy. So it's not a surprise to me that casein is going to increase cancer growth. The question is if other proteins would increase cancer growth, yes, such as just regular amino acids.
Well, you're asking two different things here. When you talk about casein, you can't say just regular amino acids.
Exactly.
That changes the conversation.
Hmm.
But basically, I had a friend, now passed away, who actually compared a whole lot of animal proteins, including casein, with a whole lot of plant proteins in their ability to be able to do a couple of things. One is elevate blood cholesterol levels, and another thing is to initiate the lesion that leads to heart disease. We call it atherogenesis. Another is to grow cells faster. And it turns out all the animal proteins acted rather like each other. There were some differences, but they all acted like each other compared to plant proteins. There was no overlap.
So is that once we exclude dairy proteins though? So the dairy has other proteins that aren't either good. Beta lactoglobulin. A lot of people don't do that well with whey. But if we exclude dairy proteins, what proteins are we talking about? The proteins in which foods are going to increase the? We have to be a little more specific than just protein, because protein could mean 1,000 different kinds of protein. So what proteins was that guy studying that they elevated the risk of cancer?
That's what I just said. He studied about 15 or 20 different proteins, about half plant-based, half animal-based. And the other proteins he had, for example, was turkey protein, from egg protein, various and sundry different kinds of proteins. All
I
animal.
see. Okay. So it's egg protein, turkey protein, stuff
Same
like
thing.
that. Okay. And that likewise elevated the risk for cancer.
Well, no, he was doing it with respect in his case. And all I said, he was the one person that compared a whole bunch of different proteins for the purpose of affecting blood cholesterol levels, and also for the purpose of actually initiating the lesion called atherogenesis that gives rise to heart disease. So he was looking at that endpoint, so to speak. But at the same time, and incidentally, you're absolutely right. Animal-based proteins, casein, milk protein, whatever, they are pro-inflammatory. Because what they do a bunch of different things. For one thing, when animal-based proteins are administered in various and sundry systems, as I said before, they do things like elevate the growth hormone for different kinds of animal proteins. They create a condition called acidic metabolic acidosis. They tend to actually affect the immune system in such a way that you get this inflammatory response. So, a whole bunch of things that animal proteins do that plant proteins either do less of or they don't do at all.
But I hear what you're saying. I think we need to shift the conversation away from plant animal versus specific kinds. So casein would just be casein rather than animal protein, and that would have a set of effects. And then there's going to be maybe turkey protein. We can talk about that. As far as IGF-1, the fact is that all the amino acids raise IGF-1 and mTOR, and so
well, I don't know what you mean by all the amino acids. Can you define that for me? I have no idea what you're talking about.
So as far as mTOR and probably and IGF-1, if you take in a lot of leucine, that's going to raise IGF-1 and mTOR, or it's really an amino acid thing when it comes to IGF-1. The total intake of protein, it doesn't matter. To my knowledge, what it's coming from, plant foods or animal foods. But if you're eating a plant-based diet, you're probably going to get less of a percentage of protein. So IGF-1 is going to probably be lower unless you're taking in plant-based protein shakes, such as pea protein or rice protein. But the point is that any protein you're going to take is going to increase IGF-1.
Well, we're getting into a different kind of conversation here. And the question I have for you is, have you read my book, Whole, W-H-O-L-E?
No, I haven't. I've read the China study, but not Whole.
Well, the Whole is a book that I published in 2013. Followed the China study, and what I'm describing in there is a very different paradigm of thinking about nutrition. What that means is that things work together. We can't talk about just one thing at a time. We can study one thing at a time, and that's what we do all the time. So we can learn the properties of one thing at a time, one mechanism, one kind of nutrient, one kind of outcome, so forth. That's the hallmark, in fact, of the entire medical system.
Right.
We call it reductionism. Okay, so the holism concept is where you acknowledge that things really work together. The nutrients work together as they're presented by food. And so when, for example, we increase protein from plant foods, it doesn't make any difference. We don't see the kind of response because under those circumstances, there's lots of antioxidants in plants. Everything is kept under control. It's almost like a synergy. I call it a symphony. When things work together like that. And so what we may learn from just looking at one protein at a time, if we want to compare one with another, that's okay. Gives us some ideas. But what really matters is when they're present in food. Okay, so the amino acid you're talking about, leucine, especially methionine, for example,
Methionine, yeah.
Those kind of amino acids, yes, you can actually administer those under certain circumstances and see an unfavorable response, for example. But that's not a natural setting, because if you're consuming the whole food and everything's in balance, the amino acid profile or composition in plants it turns out it's virtually ideal and keeps under control that theoretically otherwise, with some things that theoretically might otherwise you worry about. When they're in composition in the form of whole foods is a different story. That's why the question you're raising is from a reductionist perspective. It's not easy to answer.
Okay, I see what you're saying. The other, well, you speak about plants a lot, and I also think it's more helpful to speak about what kind of plants. So, again, plants could mean anything. You've got plants that could kill you, of course, but obviously you're referring to whole grains and fruits, vegetables, things like that. But the research with whole grains and fruits and vegetables are very different. They're different. They're different animals, and even the type of vegetable could be different. Different levels of antioxidants, different levels of whatnot. So, you talk about plants. What do you think? Do you think you should make a distinction between the type of plant?
There is some distinction, but the way you're asking the question, you need to read the book whole again, because what you're asking is, or what you're stating is, something very specific about different plants, as well as something very specific about different nutrients, whether it's protein or antioxidants, whatever. If and this is what makes the whole idea really easy. If you're eating plants, only plants, they're loaded with antioxidants. That keeps things under control. They got the right level of protein. That keeps them under control. The right level of complex carbohydrates and fat and all the rest. It all just kind of, one thing controls another. And so although you may see some differences in certain antioxidants in one kind of plant food compared to another, in reality, when you're eating a meal, different kinds of plants, it all balances out. That's really what the point is. And let me give you just an example of why this is so significant. If I take and we've done this now, if I take a whole food plant-based diet, and since you read the China study, you'll know this is true with the heart disease. If you take people with heart disease, even in advanced stages, and you put them on a whole food plant-based diet, as I'm describing it, you actually cure heart disease. It goes away forever. It's gone. There's nothing, and in paleo diet and that sort of nonsense, quite frankly, there's no way that kind of diet can actually cure heart disease. It makes it worse, not better. That's a really very important point. And with at least experimentally, we see the same thing with cancer. With diabetes, we see the same thing again. We can resolve type 2 diabetes. And those of us in the trade, we call it a chip shot. We can get rid of type 2 diabetes within a week for most people, get them off their medications. And so this whole food plant-based diet has such a dramatic effect if people really are willing to open their minds and give it a shot, give it a try, and they'll see for themselves what happens.
Are there inter-individual differences between how people would respond to plant-based diets versus maybe you can consider even a paleo diet plant-based? That's why it's a little it could be a little murky. But the diets that you advocate, could there be individual differences between the diet you advocate and maybe a paleo diet? Maybe some people do better with a paleo diet because perhaps they're predisposed to autoimmune disease, and we know there's an autoimmune cancer trade-off. So people who are more at risk for cancer, lower risk for autoimmune disease in some ways. I'm curious if if you think that there's a portion of the population that might do better with more animal foods, or it's everybody will do better with more plant-based foods.
Well, first off, your question is very good when you ask about individual differences. And we do have differences, obviously. But the differences are as follows. We differ in the degree of the response. That is to say, if you take a bunch of different people, all having various and sundry susceptibilities or disease conditions, and you put them on a plant-based diet, virtually everyone, this is our experience, everyone responds in a favorable direction. Some people, they respond so far, it means saving their life. Other people, they may not respond quite as much, but they all go in the same direction. In other words, things tend to improve. For some of us, it improves a lot. As I say, it's life-saving. Other people, it's just feeling better, and cholesterol dropping and things like this. So that's what we mean by individual differences. It does not mean like, okay, this group over here are going to respond to a whole food plant-based diet properly, and another group over here is going to be paleo. No, there's no evidence for that. In the short term, yes. People think that they have seen a difference. Let's say they tried a vegan diet, to use your word. They tried a vegan diet, they didn't do so well, so okay, we're going to try a paleo diet, and it felt better. Let's say that happens. Yes, that kind of thing, some people have reported on that, and although we don't have the complete answers to it yet, what they're looking at is short-term benefits, first off. And the second thing, if they don't use the whole food plant-based diet long enough to actually allow their body to accommodate to that, then they're not really, it's not a fair comparison.
How long is long enough?
At least a month.
At least a month. Okay, so I think people, the people on my blog at least, they've tried it for longer than a lot of the people have tried it for longer than a month.
Are they doing it completely? That's the second question. Are they using fried foods or stuff like that?
No. I think there's this is the thing. I think there's a portion of the population that's predisposed to chronic inflammation. And there's a bunch of different characteristics of these people. So I would say they're under methylators, a lot of them, and we know that, and so they do better with higher of certain amino acids such as cysteine, methionine. So methionine will allow them to methylate more. The cysteine will allow them to create more glutathione and detox in certain ways. But I think there's a lot of aspects of it and also a lot of these people, they don't do well with plant lectins. So for whatever reason, they have a lot of problems with like whole grain foods, and they get inflammation. They have like chronic fatigue. They're not the people who don't have any immediate problems, and they just like they're worried about cancer and heart disease or type 2 diabetes in the long run. Yeah.
You said two or three different things there I need to respond to. First off, you're talking about taking methionine or cysteine. Those are two sulfur amino acids, as you know.
Yeah.
And so they create their kind of amino acids more than anything else that creates this metabolic acidosis. And metabolic acidosis can be a fairly serious problem. It's associated with pro-inflammatory response. It's also, when you change the pH like that, even a small amount, it can make a fairly big difference in terms of certain enzyme activities of various kinds. And there's, 100,000 or more enzymes in our body. So you see enzyme activities begin to change when the pH starts to go down by taking sulfur amino acids. And that's a long-term effect. It can lead to increased aging or that kind of thing. So that's one thing. Forget what was the other thing.
The metabolic acidosis, that's interesting. Are there clinical trials showing that people who eat, who take in more methionine and cysteine have metabolic acidosis when they combine it with lots of plant foods like fruits and vegetables, and they're adequately hydrated?
I don't know the answer to that question. You're throwing several different experimental variables. Right. I'm not aware of that specific relationship. But it has been
But that would
shown.
be more of something that you would favor because that's more of a whole approach. You can't just say, okay, if somebody's increasing animal foods and they're eating a ton of sugar and they're living a very unhealthy lifestyle, they're not working out to create muscle to use that animal protein. That's a very different situation, than somebody who's living a healthy lifestyle, is drinking a lot of good water, eating a lot of fruits and vegetables. So in order to see if that was a problem, you'd want a whole food, a whole food approach, a whole lifestyle approach, and see if it increases the risk of metabolic acidosis. Do you agree with that?
What you're saying, and if I can say it in a slightly different way, when people are eating what I call the ideal diet, that's whole food, plant-based diet essentially, plenty of water, no added salt, sugar, and fat. When we see that kind of thing, under those circumstances, taking supplements, for example, that's the best example I can think of. When you're taking a nutrient supplement on top of that, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And in fact, there's evidence to show that for a number of different nutrients, disease gets worse, not better. I mean, nutrient supplements are not working right now. There's been a lot of research on that.
The problem is it's so complex because you have these nutrient supplements can be any the way people think of that is like it could be a huge category of supplements. So they did studies on vitamin A, vitamin E, and certain types of them. So if you were supplementing with very high doses of beta carotene or high doses of alpha tocopherol, then that's not good. But and they're also working on a whole population. But I think the new movement today is like more of individual differences, number one. So it might not help 90% of the people, but it could help 10%. And these studies wouldn't detect that, especially if it made some people worse. And then there's but there's a whole category of supplements outside of those very, very specific supplements that they did studies on, the beta carotene and the alpha tocopherol. So are you referring to other supplements?
Yeah, vitamin C.
Okay.
Evidence for vitamin C. Believe it or not, there's some for folic acid as well.
Well, okay, so vitamin C, let's go one at a time. Vitamin C, it's mostly comes back as not helpful and not harmful in the research I've read. Maybe you've got other research, but it could be helpful in very limited circumstances in the way that it's given. And then there's that's vitamin C, and they give the synthetic form of folic acid, and if you can't break that down, then it's going to cause a lot of people harm. The people with the MTHFR mutations. So again, those are 4 supplements that I actually don't recommend people take 3 of those at any time. Beta carotene, alpha tocopherol, and folic acid. But there's the methylfolate, which is different, and I bet the studies are going to be different, especially with the people with those mutations. They've done studies with those MTHFR mutations. So what do you think of that?
Well, it's a possibility that certain people may have genetic predispositions, if you will, that are significant, and might compromise their ability to handle, let's say, 1 or 2 different kinds of nutrients, including vitamins. And under those circumstances, I don't know of any. I know some studies that might indicate this is a possibility. It's more speculation than not. But if there are individuals who are compromised that way, they can't use some particular nutrient supplement, for example. Yeah, you'll see some benefit if you give it to them at that point in time. But my point is that when these studies show, for example, what are alleged to be benefits of some nutrient supplements, especially vitamins, I can understand, yes, you could see what looks like benefits if you're talking about increases in blood level with these things. That doesn't count. A lot of studies have been done that way, that you give a nutrient supplement, blood levels goes up, and then you ask, well, how do you feel? Oh, I feel great. So you got a combination of increased blood concentrations, which that's not necessarily good. And then you have the placebo effect on top of it.
Right.
And so, so if you look at the totality of it, it turns out that the ones who will respond favorably to, let's say, some specific supplement or some nutrient, the ones who tend to respond that way are, as far as we can tell, are those who are already fairly deficient in that nutrient supplement. In other words, they're big animal eaters, they're eating lots of fat and so forth and so on. They're going to be compromised with respect to obviously some vitamins, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, it makes sense. So you give a person a vitamin supplement under the circumstances, yeah, you can see something that looks beneficial. And I mean, that kind of approach was used extensively during the 80s and 90s and after 2000 to make claims. But it really wasn't fair, because when people go to use a whole food plant-based diet, then they're getting all the ideal levels of the nutrients, except for B12 possibly. But they're getting the ideal levels. And those circumstances, you give those people a nutrient supplement, no gain. Maybe no pain along with it, but no gain.
I'm in agreement with you there, especially the ones that you were talking about. And that includes also selenium. So I think you're mainly referring to those supplements that they've done a lot of research in the 80s and 90s. And I agree that, we got to follow the research. Those aren't helpful if you don't need them.
That's right.
Yeah, and even if you did need them, there's better forms of all of them, actually. You could get a whole mix of vitamin E instead of just alpha tocopherol. You could get gamma tocopherol. So the way the studies have been done, just giving a very particular type, we're in complete agreement there that that's not the way to go about supplements, at least.
No, it is. I tend to look at these kind of things more from the standpoint of understanding the basic biochemistry and the principles of nutrition that I do. It's with respect to individuals, should they take it or not take it at a point in time. But anyhow.
Mm-hmm. Are there clinical trials? There's what do the clinical trials say about and again, it's not a fair comparison. I think any diet you put anybody on that's on a standard American diet, you're going to do better. And you've said that you agree with that.
Well, not quite. Like just to cite for you a case in point. The standard American diet, we all agree, is not exactly that great, right?
Right.
I think we probably agree to that. So there was a study, not published not very long ago, I have to tell you, that compared the paleo diet with the standard American diet. And of course, the hope was, obviously, the paleo diet people were going to be better, right?
Right.
They were not. As a matter of fact, if you look at cholesterol levels, LDL, and things like that, but even more to the point, and incidentally, these are results that were published in the paper, was done by Atkins enthusiasts or the low-carb enthusiasts. And what they showed was that constipation was increased going to the paleo diet, bad breath was increased, muscular pains and aches was increased, and on down the line, there were about 8 different metrics they did.
Were they eating vegetables, a lot of vegetables, and drinking adequate water?
I don't know. It was pretty much of a paleo diet. Paleo diet, you were saying that's a vegetable type diet. No, it's not. Lauren Kerdane, I've debated him 3 times. He's the father of this thing. He says that, but he's not right. It simply is not right. You look at a person consuming a paleo diet, you'll see a big pile of meat, dairy, and eggs on it. Not dairy necessarily. But you'll see, because they don't advocate that, but certainly meat and eggs and cheese and all the rest of it, and plenty of fat.
That's why I don't like those labels, paleo diet, because what does a paleo diet mean? You got a paleo diet, somebody's just taking down 3 pounds of meat a day, and then you could have somebody who's just who's taking down a ton of vegetables and fruits and just staying away from grains, and they're not going overboard with anything. They're kind of just listening to their body as far as how much protein they want and how much protein they do better with. So I'm not in favor of a paleo diet. I'm not an advocate of a paleo diet at all. But I think it's just again I'm here. I'm trying to see, well, how would a whole food plant-based diet that you advocate compare to more of an omnivorous diet that's that has plant foods, a lot of plant foods in them, a lot of vegetables, and I'm not aware of any of those kinds of studies. Are you?
Yes, from a slightly different perspective. That is to say, when For example, let's say people with heart disease. It's so dramatic there. If they go to whole food plant-based diet, they see the dramatic reversal of the disease, period. In fact, the most recent study on that was done by Dr. Esselstyn at the Cleveland Clinic. You may know he's a friend of mine, actually. But in any case, he was a surgeon. He did the work. You read about the China study. He just came out with a new paper last July. And he started, and these are people that he had counseled. They're all heart disease patients. He had counseled them in the last 8-10 years or so privately, although to some extent at the Cleveland Clinic. And they were told to go on this diet. They had heart problems. It turned out, and then he went back later, between 2 and 7 years later, and he asked him, he said, "How are you doing?" Then he started out with 198, and 179 of the 198 said they're still complying. In other words, they're using a whole food plant-based diet. In that group of 179 people, average compliance was 3.48 years, I think it was. But in any case, of those 179 people, already at risk of heart disease in the beginning because they had heart attacks and so forth, they had one person out of the 179. Only one person, less than 1%. And that person actually died. But it turned out I happen to know that person because I'm the one that recommended him to go there. And his wife told me that he was not complying. But in any case, one person out of 179, less than 1% return heart disease. Of the 178, about the other 20 that said no, they're not doing it. 67% of those people had another heart attack. That's less than 1% versus 67%. Now I know that was unusually high. Usually one would expect on historical records to be somewhere around 30%, recidivism, if you will. So there's a huge difference. And that was just published in the Journal of Family Practice last July. Just one more.
Yes, sorry, go.
If they deviate, if those individuals deviate a little bit fat or a little bit of this, a little bit of that, their numbers start going in the wrong direction.
Okay, I'm willing to concede there that that there is some evidence that the diet that you advocate is good for heart disease. And it's probably it could be optimal for heart disease. I mean, there's no studies comparing it to diet, just a more omnivorous diet maybe that's very healthy in other ways. But as if you just want to look at the evidence, then I would agree with you there that with regard to heart disease, the plant-based diet that you advocate seems to have amongst diets seems to have the biggest effect for heart disease. My only concern there is part of the mechanism is by lowering LDL levels. So lowering LDL could be good for heart disease. Some people will argue with that, but I think if you look at the totality of research, they're looking mainly now at LDLP, which is it's a certain type of LDL cholesterol. It's the LDL particle number, but that correlates with the general LDL levels and so there is if you have higher LDL levels, you will be at risk for heart disease. But what I wanted to look at was total mortality and LDL, and so I did some research, and all the studies came back that if your LDL was lower than 100, your mortality was actually going to go up. Your risk of dying was going to go up. Total mortality, not just heart disease. Maybe even heart disease went down. But if you look at total mortality went when it was under 100 or over 130. So it was that range between 100 and 130 that was ideal for total mortality. And I think the reason that is because LDL is an antioxidant in the system, in your body. And it's also important for your cell membranes and for various other functions. So I agree that maybe heart disease, it could go down. But Mike, have you looked into any of the effects with like the cognitive effects? Because once LDL goes down, it could maybe your brain might not function as well. Is that something that you looked into?
No, actually, the way you describe that is very reductionist, by the way. I have to go back to the poll again. you're picking things out one at a time. And you're talking about LDL, for example, being an antioxidant. It's not an antioxidant. LDL carries antioxidants like beta carotene, for example. So you're confounding the alleged effects of LDL on versus the outcomes when in fact it's an antioxidant with it. And also it's not just LDL anyhow. That's not the best metric. The better metric is the ratio of HDL to LDL or total to LDL, as you probably know.
Yeah.
And of course then particle size, yes, that comes into play. You can talk about not just that, you can talk about oxidized and non-oxidized.
That's the main one, actually. The oxidized LDL is the worst. And that depends on oxidative stress.
Of course, exactly. You're absolutely right on that. The oxidized LDL is the worst according to its association with heart disease. And it makes sense. But the point is that, again, you're picking out one, as I say, one, whether it's LDL, HDL, total, ratio, whatever, you're still isolating one metric at a time, one biomarker at a time. And as you just said, and I'm sure we agree to this, the state of oxidation, antioxidation in a totality is also important. As far as mortality is concerned, by the way, I don't know of any evidence that, mortality for specifically related to low LDL levels, for example, was what you said.
That is like 3 meta-analysis, or I'm not sure if there maybe it's only one meta-analysis, but there definitely are multiple studies showing when the LDL goes below 100, total mortality increases. Now, you can argue that maybe it's more of a side effect when somebody's really sick. Maybe their LDL goes down. I'm not discounting that. I'm just saying if you look at the whole, the total mortality, which is the most important thing. We heart disease, obviously, if you got it, then if you decrease heart disease, obviously you're going to have your best shot in decreasing total mortality. But just somebody else, they want to know, okay, my LDL levels, what's my optimal level? And the only way to know that, there's no way to know that for sure, but these studies, I think maybe they are definitely reductionist, but you don't think they have value?
No, I don't, especially when you're talking about total mortality. It makes common sense. Of course, death is more important than any other metric, outcome like this. Well, I think we probably agree on that. But the fact is, the total mortality figures are really been misrepresented. Namely, it's this. Total mortality for heart disease has declined in the last 3 or 4 decades, as you may know.
Yeah.
It's gradually going down. Incidence is not. Mortality is coming down. You say, oh, this is great news because we care about mortality, not incidence. Well, the reason mortality is going down is quite clear now. Is because the care that's given to people with a heart problem is much, much better than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. If people have a heart problem, heart attack, if you will, an MI or something like that, they're attended to much faster. And so it's the rapidity with which they're getting care that's actually caused mortality to go down. People can have heart attacks these days. If they get care quickly, that makes a difference. It really makes a difference. So mortality is not a good outcome measurement. And those studies you're talking about, if they're only looking at mortality, I couldn't disagree more. You have to go back and make sure that they have done some adjustment, for the kind of care that those people may have gotten.
I think they did some adjustments, but I have to refamiliarize myself with exactly what they did because obviously that's extremely important, like you're mentioning.
I think it's important.
Yeah. So, all right. That was very interesting. So, is there, besides, what are the other mechanisms that it increases heart disease? Do you think it's because it's increasing inflammation, oxidized LDL, or decreasing oxidized LDL? Have they measured those markers with the the diet you advocate?
Well, that's what's fascinating about your question. It does all those things. Mm-hmm. And that's why I want you to read it whole. Come back to that again. Because it turns out that the default position of the body, I'm convinced, is to create health.
Right.
You might agree to that.
Yeah.
The default position is to create health. Every instant, and that means every nanosecond, for the 10 to 100 trillion cells that's in our body, they're always trying to create health. Trying to stabilize things. Even when we insert our body with the wrong thing, it's still doing the best it can to adapt to those conditions. That's called maladaptation. So the default position is to create health. And so when we recognize that, we also need to recognize that any kind of reaction that goes on in the body, we might isolate it, talk about it as this and that and everything else. It's actually very much related to everything else going on. Mm-hmm. And so whatever we learn when we're looking at things in isolation, especially in the laboratory or a petri dish or a test tube, if you will, when we start doing it that way, we're missing a huge part of the effect. And so what you need to do, and when you're looking at, you were asking before at the beginning of the conversation about what evidence did I have for protein. I actually, in our research, this started, as I say, many years ago, as you may recall from the China study, we saw an effect. At least I thought we saw an effect, and the Indian worker said, showed us that effect, that higher protein increases cancer in the experimental animals in that case. So we took that model, and I was going forward, we were looking for the mechanism. I'm thinking just like everybody else. We're looking for the specific thing that protein does that would account for this effect. Every time we looked for a so-called mechanism, it seemed like we found one. And all of a sudden, then, the whole world was starting to explode, at least for me. And all of a sudden, then I started realizing that all of these things are going together. And it's the totality of these things that really makes it, creates this really remarkable effect that we now see.
Right.
And that's the concept of holism. It really is amazing.
So the concept, I agree with you. The concept of holism is certainly important. But a lot of the things that you're talking about are, and I'm curious how you would respond to this, they're dealing with animal studies, and animals don't live in a human world. They're not exposed to our light cycles. They're not exposed to the stressors. They're not exposed to the myriad of differences that humans are exposed to. And so that kind of that kind of puts a damper on the animal studies that you use to show it increases cancer or not. So do you think that could be that could theoretically be reductionist if you're looking at?
Of course, it's a reasonable question and it's a reasonable supposition on the one hand, but on the other hand, I should remind you that the basic metabolism goes on in mammals, in their cells, is almost identical to what it goes on in our cells. I was not looking at animals to look at the differences in response. I was looking for metabolic reactions, the glucose cycle, the glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, if you will. Glycolysis, Krebs cycle, those kind of things. They're almost identical. In fact, the Krebs cycle, for example, in your skin cell is very similar to what you might see in a leaf of a maple tree. So, we learn a lot by looking at conditions that are non-human experimental setups, because we learn a lot about how do reactions go, how do they interrelate to each other, all that kind of thing. And you might be surprised, we are animals. And we do respond like other animals to most things. And so we're looking for principles. But in any case, go back to your question. Good question. You would think that experimental animal research doesn't count. In a sense, you want to discard it. That was the reason for one of the major reasons I wanted to do the study in China. Because that was a human population. We collected massive amounts of information. It was the most comprehensive study ever done in the history of medicine. I wanted to look at all these things were measured, put them together to see if, in fact, they related to what we found in the laboratory. And I was absolutely, I have to say, I was just much more impressed than I ever thought I would be. That the results that we got in the human studies were essentially identical to what we had concluded in the animal studies.
Yeah, they were epidemiological studies, right?
Yeah, but nonetheless, two different approaches to the problem, right?
Right.
And epidemiological studies are fine if you're looking for dietary patterns. If you're going to focus on individual correlation, no, they're not.
So what kind of patterns did you find in those epidemiological studies? And who were you studying? And what did it show?
Well, we basically collected data on 6,500 families. That meant, mother and father and children. 6,500 families altogether, at least 12,000 people, but at least 6,500 families. And we actually looked across 130 villages across the country. So we had a lot of heterogeneity, in high areas, low areas for all the different diseases, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a nice range, really, really very impressive range. Some places the cancer was very high, in other cancers very low. And then we measured as many things as we could. We measured about 14 different actual nutrient methodologies. We collected data to find out what they were eating. We measured that in two ways too. We didn't just go ask them, what'd you eat for the last 3 days?
Right.
We did that just to get the correspondence. What we did, we went into the homes and actually measured exactly what food they ate for the 3 days. Almost no one ever does that. And then we took it and made a composite of it, and we analyzed it for minerals and all kinds of things. And so we collected, and others have said, and I would argue, that our data were more comprehensive and better done than any other single epidemiological study ever. So then we ended up with a lot of correlations, okay? And I know so well, in spite of what people have said, they said I was using correlations. They're lying. It's not true. I know that. I've lectured on it. In fact, I wrote about it in advance. You can't do that. And so what we did, we looked at all the patterns of correlations, for example. The patterns of correlations that would involve, let's say, exposure, that's what you're consuming, compared to metabolic indicators, that's what you measure in blood, compared to disease outcomes. 3 different sort of entry points, if you will. And we combined all of this together. And one of the more significant things that I think we saw was when I looked at all the mortality data for about at least 4 dozen different diseases, cancers, heart disease, infectious disease, and all the rest. And we made a sort of a matrix, with the XY axis on the matrix, so that every mortality rate for every disease was in there. It could be measured against itself as well as all the other diseases. And what came out of it was a pattern, like a hologram. What came out of it was very clear. The Western kind of diseases, heart diseases, cancer, diabetes, they all aggregated together, generally in the more urban areas, by the way. Although we didn't include the urban areas, just in approaching the urban areas. And then when we did that, I simply asked the question, we ended up with 2 groups of disease. One, the Western kind of diseases, the other is the poverty kind of diseases. Then I simply asked, well, what things did we measure in the blood, that we might examine that might be related to that in the aggregate? It turned out it was total blood cholesterol was highly, highly significant. As soon as the blood cholesterol levels started to go up from very low levels, by the way, from around 80 to 90 milligrams per deciliter, we don't see that in this country. From that on up to about 160, as the cholesterol started to go up, that's when these Western diseases started to appear. Very impressive, and it was highly, highly significant. If you're familiar with statistics, it was significant to 0.001 level of probability, something less than that. So then we started looking at individual parts of that equation, different components, using the same sort of metric. We did it for total mortality and all the different diseases. We started looking at things like osteoporosis, and various and sundry things like that to see, always with an effort to try to look more comprehensively. When you look more comprehensively, then you can make a statistical argument as whether or not that was or was not significant in the aggregate. Not with respect to individual things, in the aggregate. And then you say, okay, I look at this aggregate collection of diseases, or I look at this aggregate collection of biomarkers in the blood, or the things being exposed to, and I can pick out individual things that were kind of indicators of that aggregate group. And so it was an analysis that was much more comprehensive.
So you found that the higher their cholesterol went up, the higher their. But what about there's a whole bunch of other factors that you could be testing. Did you check for, let's say, the amount of fish that they consume and their levels of total mortality?
Yep, sure did. We collected fish. There's some places in China that eat a lot of fish.
Yeah.
This is in rural China. They eat a lot of fish, especially along the great river basins, the Yellow River, the Yangtze River basins. They eat a lot of fish, and along the coast. By the way, they also get a very high rate of nasopharyngeal cancer, too, in those regions, probably because of nitrosamines present in fish. So we measure nitrosamines. We measure nitrosamines also, a bunch of different nitrosamines in the area of middle China, where there's a very high gastric cancer rate. It's sort of more the same etiology, nasopharyngeal, esophageal, gastric. They're very similar.
So what did you find with total mortality in fish intake?
Oh, well, keep in mind, again, you just mortality. If you see it, you have to take other considerations too. But the mortality for fish, I can't tell you exactly what it was. Maybe I can show you. Here's a book that you probably haven't seen. Have you?
No.
This is the book.
Diet, Lifestyle, and Mortality in China.
It costs about $700, by the way, to get out. But this was our book. And I want to just show you this because it's, as I say, it's about 900 pages. It's huge, huge amounts of data in here. Let me show you, just like to show you this.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see that?
Yeah, I can see that.
But this is one thing here. This is red blood cell, total lipid, one of the fatty acids in the red blood cells. Here's all the data for all the counties. Here's a way to compare all this stuff to see how good these data are. Here's a correlation of this one thing here with all the other diseases. And here is a graphic. So of the 367 things that we measured in this sample, which was huge, we had really extensive amounts of data in here.
Interesting. So, yeah, the reason I'm curious about fish and mortality in general.
Yeah, let's look at fish.
Because I've read like a dozen studies and meta-analysis from studying people in different countries. So they're in different environments. And the picture is pretty clear that when people eat 2 to 3 times a week fish, the mortality goes down. Over that, it actually goes up a little, over maybe 4 times a week or whatever it is. And under that, it goes up. And then for heart disease, though, it goes down the most. That's what's the most dramatic. And these studies are across the board. What would you say to those studies?
Well, there is some evidence. Of course, there was some evidence some years ago on that from the Eskimos, as you may know. And it was alleged that they went down because they were consuming more omega-3s, in particular, the ratio of omega-3 fats compared to omega-6s. And there seemed to be a little bit of truth in that at the time. But quite frankly, when they went back and looked at the mortality data for those individuals, the Eskimos, for example, they didn't live long enough to get the real good data for heart disease. Their number one cause of death was trauma. And so, some of that information from years past that still gets cited.
No, but I'm not even talking about the Eskimos. They've done multiple studies that are in the French, in the Japanese, in the Chinese, in Americans, Europeans, and without fail, 2 to 3 times a week fish mortality goes down and heart disease goes down dramatically. And that's from the probably.
I don't like you use the word dramatically. Because if you're talking about dramatic, what kind of percentage reduction are you talking about?
You see, it depends on the metric, and it depends on the study. But at least maybe like 50%. If I had to just
50% down to for fish eaters, no.
They didn't check total cardiovascular disease. They would check like ischemic heart disease, and then they would check different kinds of heart disease. So I'd have to double check on exactly how much on what marker, but there was patterns, and like this kind of heart disease went down dramatically. This went down, but overall, if you looked at heart disease overall, it definitely went down very significantly, 0.0001, whatever it is.
Well, that may have been 1 or 2 studies. I don't know, but there's other studies, and I can't speak to the details of this because I haven't kept up with it. But there's other summaries of some of that earlier information that comes to the opposite conclusion. It doesn't go down for sure.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, this conversation has been great, and I really appreciate your questions. And you're a bright guy, by the way. I have to tell you, I appreciate your penetrating questions. I'm going to have to go because I've got another Skype thing to call.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, fine. So I definitely appreciate you enlightening us in various ways and telling us how we got to get out of the reductionist thinking. So where can people find you?
They usually can't. I give a lot of lectures. I've given at least 600 lectures since the China study came out all over the world. And so if they want to go to my website, that's called nutritionstudies.org.
Okay.
Nutritionstudies.org. There'll be a list of some lectures there. I'm trying to cut them down. But, if they want to come to one of my lectures, that's one way to do it. And I'm still giving some, coming up. And I say I'm really trying to cut them down.
Okay, fine. Yeah, so that's great, and people can buy your book, The China Study, the book that you co-authored.
Can I just launch her on the air here like this? I would like to suggest a book that my youngest son, who co-authored the China Study with me,
Oh, great. Yeah.
who's a physician now. He is my son, and so I got to allow for this prejudice. But he and I lectured together. His ability to analyze data is the best of anyone I know of in this field. He really gets into the research because he got into all the data and really learned it quite well. He's on the faculty at the University of Rochester. He's just now been appointed with his wife, who's also a physician, as the director of a new program called Nutrition and Cancer in a major medical school. This is the first one of its kind in the country. And he has a book called The Campbell Plan. So if people want to get another, I would suggest, good book showing people how, it's kind of a how-to thing. Sort of dissecting some of the literature, showing people to a great extent how can they sort of take this diet and do something with it. So I would like to make a plug for that.
Definitely, that's great. Yeah, so people should definitely buy that book.
We also have another one more, the online course that we have called Plant-Based Nutrition. Mm-hmm. That's that website, nutritionstudies.org. This is done in collaboration between my nonprofit and Cornell University online course. And Cornell University is offering something like more than 200 courses now of Cornell faculty, as I'm a faculty member too. And of those 200 courses, we're ranked number 1. And we offer continuing medical education credits for doctors. So what we're trying to do, and the reason for my telling you this, is in this field, it's so confusing for so many people. We have information that I regard as really, it's fantastic, but most people don't know it. Mm-hmm. And so, unfortunately, much of this stuff that's being discussed is not professional. It's not being evaluated by professional people. And so I really want this information to be elevated to a level that we're talking about data. That's why I complimented you on the way you're looking at this, because I already picked up you're beating a good many people.
I appreciate that.
Looking at it in some detail and getting at it. So that's, kudos for you.
I appreciate that, but I think we can always up the amount of that, the amount that we know about these things, and try to read different perspectives. Not only, if you're low carb or paleo, try to look at some other perspectives and see what's going on. Don't just be hyper focused.
Yeah, well, keep at it. I've got to run because
okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.